first bit of reading I'm going to be doing out loud is a book called The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat, by a neuroscientist called Oliver Sacks, recommended to me by my science teacher at high school, who gave me a stern telling off. You know the classic: if you don't do anything about your life, you won't go anywhere, and the path that you've told me you want to go on, blah blah blah, personal reasons, get your acting together. And so he liked to read. Obviously, most scientists, analytical people do. He knew that I like to read. He suggested a few books, but this is the one that I took, and I really enjoyed. It's an account of short stories from Dr. Oliver Sacks' career. I'm going to read the one which the book is titled The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat, about a man who mistook his wife for a hat. This book has been, I took it out at a library and I forgot to give it back. Oh, it's the first story. Oh. Thought it was in part 2, but apparently not. We'll go to... Is it? Double check that. Part 1, losses. The man who mistook his wife for a hat. Starts on page 11. There we are. Chapter 1, the man who mistook his wife for a hat. Dr. P was a musician of distinction, well known for many years as a singer, and then at a local school of music as a teacher. It was here in the relation to the students that certain strange problems were first observed. Sometimes a student was presenting himself and Dr. P would not recognize him, or specifically would not recognize his face. The moment the student spoke, he would recognize him by his voice. Such incidents multiplied, causing embarrassment, perplexity, fear, and sometimes comedy. For not only did Dr. P increasingly fail to see faces, but he saw faces where there were no faces. To see genially, Magoo-like. And see faces where there were no faces to see. Genially, Magoo-like, when in the street, he might pat the heads of water hydrants and parking meters, taking these to be the heads of children. He would amiably address knobs of furniture and be astounded when they didn't reply. At first, these odd mistakes were laughed off as jokes, not least by Dr. P himself. Had he not always had a quirky sense of humour and been given Zen-like paradoxes and jests, his musical powers were as dazzling as ever. He did not feel ill, he had never felt better. And the mistakes were so ludicrous and so ingenious that they could hardly be serious or be taken anything serious. The notion of there being something the matter did not emerge until some 3 years later, when diabetes developed. Well aware that diabetes could affect his eyes, Dr. P consulted an ophthalmologist who took careful history and examined his eyes closely. But there was nothing the matter with your eyes, the doctor concluded. But there is trouble with the visual parts of your brain. You don't need help You don't need my help, but you must see a neurologist. And so as a result from the referral, Dr. P came to me. It was obvious within a few seconds of meeting him that there was no trace of dementia in the ordinary sense. He was a man of great cultivation and charm, who talked well and fluently, unlike myself, with imagination and humour. I couldn't think why he had been referred to our clinic, and yet there was something a bit odd. He faced me as he spoke, was oriented towards me, and yet there was something the matter. It was difficult to formulate. He faced me with his ears. He faced me with his ears, and I came to think, but not with his eyes. These instead of looking, gazing at me, taking me in the normal way, he made sudden strange fixations on my nose, on my right ear, down to my chin, up to my right eye, as if nothing, even studying these individual features, but not seeing my whole face. It's changing expressions, me as a whole. I'm not sure that I fully realized this at the time. There was just a teasing strangeness, some failure in normal interplay of the gaze and expression. He saw me, scanned me, and yet, what seems to be the matter? I asked him at length. Nothing that I know of, he replied with a smile, but people seem to think there's something wrong with my eyes. But you don't recognize any visual problems? No, not directly, but I occasionally make mistakes. I left the room briefly to talk to his wife. When I came back, Dr. P was sitting placidly by the window, alternative, listening rather than looking out at the traffic. Or looking out. Traffic, he said. Street sounds. Distant trains. They make a sort of symphony, do they not? You know Hoegner's Pacific 234. What a lovely man, I thought to myself. How can there be anything seriously the matter? Would he permit me to examine him? Yes, of course, Dr. Sachs. I stilled my disquiet, his perhaps too in the soothing routine of a neurological exam. Muscle strength, coordinations, reflexes, tone. It was while examining his reflexes, a trifle abnormal on the left side, that the first bizarre experiences occurred. I had taken off his left shoe, and scratched the sole of his foot with a key. A frivolous seeming, but essential test of a reflex. And then excusing myself to screw my ophthalmoscope together, left him to put the shoe on himself. To my surprise, a minute later, he had not done this. Can I help? I asked. Help what? Help whom? Help you put on your shoe. Ach, he said. I'd forgotten the shoe, adding a scotto voice. The shoe? The shoe? He seemed baffled. Your shoe, I repeated. Perhaps you'd put it on, he continued to look down, though not at the shoe, with an intense but misplaced concentration. Finally, his gaze settled on his foot. That is my shoe, yes. Did I mishear? Did I missee? My eyes? He explained and put a hand to his foot. No. This is my shoe, no. No, that is not. That is your foot. There is your shoe. Ah, I thought that was my foot. Was he joking? Was he mad? Was he blind? If this was one of these strange mistakes, it was one of the strangest mistakes I had ever come across. I helped him with his shoe, his foot. To avoid further complications, Dr. P seemed untroubled, indifferent, maybe amused. I resumed my examination. His visual acuity was good. He had no difficulty seeing a pin on the floor, though sometimes he missed it as if it was placed to his left. He saw all right, but what did he see? I opened out a copy of the National Geographic Museum and asked him to describe some of the pictures in it. His responses were very curious. His eyes would dart from one thing to another, picking up tiny features, individual features, as if they had done with my face. A striking brightness, a colour, a shape would arrest his attention and elicit comment. But in no case did he get the scene as a whole. He failed to see the whole scene, only seeing details which he spotted like blips on a radar screen. He never entered into relation the picture as a whole, never faced, so to speak, its physiognomy. He had no sense whatsoever of the landscape or scene. I showed him the cover, an unbroken expanse of Sahara dunes. What do you see here? I asked. I see a river, he said. A little guest house with it, and a little guest house with its terrace on the water. People are dining out on the terrace. I see coloured parasols here and there. He was looking right off the cover into midair and confabulating non-existent features, as if the absence of features in the actual picture had driven him to imagine the river and the terrace and the coloured parasols. I must have looked aghast, but he seemed to think he had done rather well. There was a hint of a smile on his face. He also appeared to have decided that the examination was over and started to look around for his hat. He reached out his hand and took hold of his wife's head and tried to lift it off and put it on. He had apparently mistaken his wife for a hat. His wife looked as if she was used to such things. I could make no sense of what occurred in terms of conventional neurology or neuropsychology. In some ways he seemed perfectly preserved, and in others absolutely incomprehensibly devastated. How could he on one hand mistake his wife for a hat, on the other function as apparently as he did as a teacher at the music school? I had to think, to see him again, and see him in his own familiar habitat at home. A few days later, I called on Dr. P and his wife at the... A few days later, I called on Dr. P and his wife at home. The score of some German word I won't pronounce in my briefcase. I knew he liked Schumann and a variety of odd objects for testing of perception. Ms. P showed me into the lofty apartment, which recalled a fin de siècle Berlin. German words, don't understand. A magnificent Bosendorfer stood in the center of the room, and all around it there were musical stands, instruments, scores. There were books, there were paintings, but the music was central. Dr. P came in and, distracted, advanced with an outstretched hand to the grandfather clock, but hearing my voice, corrected himself and shook hands with me. We exchanged greetings and chatted a little of current concerts, performances. Diffidently, I asked him if he would sing. The Dice Libre, he exclaimed. But I can no longer read music. You will play them, yes? I said I would try. On that wonderful old piano, even my playing sounded right, and Dr. P was an aged but indefinitely mellow, more German words, combining a perfect ear and voice with the most incisive musical intelligence. It was clear that the music school was not keeping him out of charity. Dr. P's temporal lobes were obviously intact, and he had a wonderful musical cortex. What, I wondered, was going on in his partial and os- occipital lobes, especially in those areas where visual processing occurred. I carry on the platonic solids in my neurological kit and decided to start with these. What is this? I asked, drawing out the first one. A cube, of course. Now this. I asked, brandishing another. He asked if you might examine it, which she did swiftly and systematically. A dodecahedron, of course, and don't bother me with the others. I'll get the icosahedron too. Abstract object clearly presented no problems. What about faces? I took out a pack of cards. All of these he identified instantly, including the jacks, the queens, the kings, and the joker. But these, after all, are stylized designs, and it was impossible to tell whether he saw the faces or merely patterns. I decided I would show him a volume of cartoons, which I had in my briefcase. Here, again. For the most part, he did well. Churchill's cigar, Schnozzle's nose, and soon he had picked out a key feature he could identify the face. But cartoons, again, are formal and schematic. It reminded to be seen how he would do with real faces, realistically presented. I turned on the television, keeping the sound off, and found an early Bette Davis film. A love scene was in progress. Dr. P failed to identify the actress, but this could have been because she had never entered his world. What was more striking was that he failed to identify the expression on her face. Her partners, though, in the course of the single torrid scene, these passed from sultry yearning through passion, surprise, disgust, and fury to a melting recollection. Dr. P could make nothing of any of this. He was very unclear as to what was going on, or who was even, or what sex they were. His comments in the scene were positively Martian. It was just possible that some of his difficulties were associated with the unreality of the celluloid Hollywood world, and it occurred to me that he might be more successful at identifying faces from his own life. And on the walls of the apartment were photographs of his family, his colleagues, his pupils, himself. I gathered a pile of these together and with some misgivings presented them to him. What had been funny or farcical in any relation to the movie was tragic in relation to real life. By and large, he recognized nobody, neither his family, nor his colleagues, nor his pupils, nor himself. He recognized a portrait of Einstein because he picked up on the characteristic hair and mustache. And the same thing happened with one or two of the people. "Ah, Paul," he said, when shown a portrait of his brother. "That square jaw, those big teeth, I would know Paul anywhere." But was it Paul he recognized, or one or two of his features, on the basis of which he could make a reasonable guess as to the subject's identity in the voice of obvious markers? Was he utterly lost? But it was not merely the cognition, the gnosis, at fault. There was something radically wrong with the whole way he proceeded, for he approached these faces. Even of those near and dear, as if they were abstract puzzles or tests. He did not relate to them. He did not behold, nor face was familiar to him. Seen as though being just identified a set of features, and it thus was formal, but no trace of personal gnosis, and with this went his indifference or blindness to expression. A face to us in a person looking out. We see as it were, the person through his persona, his face. But for Dr. P, there was no persona in this sense, no outward persona, no person within. I had stopped at a florist on my way into his apartment and bought myself an extravagant red rose for my buttonhole. I now removed this and handed it to him. He took it like a botanist, like a morphologist, like given a specimen, not like a person given a flower. About 6 inches in length, he commented. A convoluted red form with a linear green attachment. Yes, I said, encouragingly. And what do you think it is, Dr. P? Not easy to say. He seemed perplexed. It lacks the simple symmetry of the Platonic solids, although it may have a higher symmetry of its own. I think this could be an inflorescence or flower. Could be, I queried. Could be, he confirmed. Smell it, I suggested, and he again looked somewhat puzzled, as if I'd asked him to smell a higher symmetry, but he complied, cautiously, and took his nose, but now suddenly came to life. Beautiful, he exclaimed. An early rose, what a heavenly smell. He started to hum. Die rose, die lily. Reality, it seemed, might be conveyed by smell, not sight. I tried one final test. It was still a cold day in early spring. I had thrown my coat and gloves on the sofa. What is this? I asked, holding up a glove. May I examine it? He asked, taking it from me. He proceeded to examine it. He had examined the geometrical shapes. A continuous surface, he announced. At last, enfolded on itself, it appears to have. He hesitated. 5 outpouchings? As if this was the word. As if this is the word. Yes, I said cautiously. You have given me a description, now tell me what it is. A container of sort. Yes, I said. And what would it contain? It would contain its contents, said Dr. P with a laugh. There is many possibilities it could be. A change purse, for example, for coins of 5 sizes. It could. I interrupted with a balmy flow. Does it not look familiar? Do you not think it might fit a part of your body? No light recognition dawned in his face. No child would have the power to speak of continuous surface unfolded on itself. But any child, any infant would immediately know it was a glove. A glove. See it as a familiar, as going with a hand. Dr. P didn't. He saw nothing as familiar visually. He was lost in a world of lifeless abstractions. Indeed, he did not have a real visual world, as he did not have a real visual. Later, by accident, he got it and exclaimed, "My God, it's a glove!" This was reminiscent of Kurt Goldstein's patient Latuni, who could only recognize objects by trying to use them in action. I'll go back a second. He did not have a real visual self. He could not speak about things, but he did not see them face to face. Hewlings-Jackson's discussing patients with aphasia and left hemisphere lesions says they have lost abstract and prepositional thought and compares them with dogs, or rather he compares dogs to patients with aphasia. Dr. P, on the other hand, had functioned precisely as a machine functions. It wasn't merely that he displayed the same indifference to the visual world as a computer, but more strikingly, he constructed the world as a computer constructs it. By means of key features and schematic relationships, the scheme might be identified as an identikit, way without reality being grasped at all. The testing I had done so far told me nothing about Dr. P's inner world. Was it possible that his visual memory and imagination were still intact? I asked him to imagine entering one of our local squares from the north side, to walk through it and imagine it in imagination or memory, and tell me the buildings he might pass as he walked. He listed the buildings on his right side, but none of those on his left. I then asked him to imagine entering the square from the south again. He mentioned only those buildings that were on the right, although these were the very buildings he admitted before, those he had seen internally before but were not mentioned now. Presumably, they were no longer seen. It was evident that his difficulties with leftness, his visual field deficits, were as much internal as external, bisecting his visual memory and imagination. What at higher level of his internal visualization, thinking, the almost hallucinatory intensity with which Trollzeu, more German, and he animates his characters. I questioned Dr. P about Anna Karina. He would remember the incidents without difficulty and remembers incidents without difficulty, had an undiminished grasp of the plot, but completely omitted visual characteristics, visual narratives or scenes. He remembered the words of the characters, but not their faces, and though when asked he would quote his remarkable and almost verbatim memory of the original visual descriptions. These were, it became apparent, quite empty for him, and lacked sensorial, imaginal, or emotional reality. Thus was an internal agnosia as well. But this was only the case when it became clear with certain sorts of visualization. The visualizations of faces and scenes and visual narratives and drama. This was profoundly impaired, almost absent, but the visualization of the schemata was preserved, perhaps enhanced. I should have mentioned that the weird bit I went off before was a note in the book. So I'll say, I'll preface it's a note before I read the note. Another note. I have often wondered about Helen Keller's visual descriptions, where these, for all their eloquence, are somehow empty as well. Or whether by the transference of images, the tactile to the visual, or yet more extraordinarily from the verbal and metaphorical to the sensorial and the visual, she did achieve the power of visual imagery, even though her visual cortex had never been stimulated directly by the eyes. In Dr. P's case, it is precisely the cortex that was damaged, the organic prerequisite of all pictorial imagery, interestingly and typically no longer dreamed pictorially, the message of the dream being conveyed in non-visual terms. End of the note. Thus, when I engaged him in a game of mental chess, he had no difficulty visualizing the chessboard or the moves, indeed. No difficulty in beating me soundly. Luria said of Zatsky that he entirely lost his capacity to play games, but that his vivid imagination was unpaired. Zatsky and Dr. P lived in worlds which were mirror images of each other, but the saddest difference between them was that Zatsky, as Luria said, fought to regain his lost faculties with indomitable tenacity of the damned, whereas Dr. P was not fighting, did not know that what he had lost, not indeed fought for anything was lost, thought anything was lost, but who was more tragic or who was more damned, the man who knew it or the man who did not. When the examinations were over, Miss P called us to the table where there was coffee, delicious spread of little cakes. Hungrily, hummingly, Dr. P started on the cakes swiftly, fluidly, unthinkingly, melodiously. He pulled the plates towards him and took this and that and great in a great gurgling stream, an edible song of food until suddenly there came an interruption. A loud premonitory rat-tat-tat at the door. Startled and taken aback, arrested by the interruptions, Dr. P stopped eating, sat frozen, motionless at the table, and indifferent, blind bewilderment on his face. He saw, but no longer saw table, no longer perceived it. The table is laden with cakes. His wife poured him some coffee. The smell titillated his nose and brought him back to reality. The melody of eating resumed. How does he do anything? I wondered to myself. What happens when he's dressing? Goes to the lavatory? Has a bath? I followed his wife into the kitchen and asked her, how, for instance, has he managed to dress himself? Is it just like the eating? It's just like the eating, she explained. He put his usual clothes out in the usual places, and he dresses without difficulty, singing to himself. He does everything singing to himself. But if he's interrupted and loses the thread, it comes to a complete stop. Doesn't know his clothes or his own body. He sings all the time, eating songs, dressing songs, bathing songs, everything. He can't do anything unless he's making a noise. While we were taking my attention, while we were talking, my attention was caught by the pictures on the walls. Yes, Miss P said. He was a gifted painter as well as a singer. The school exhibited his pictures every year. I strolled past them curiously. They were in chronological order. All his works was neuralistic and realistic, and with vivid mood and atmosphere, but finely detailed and concrete. Then, years later, they become less vivid, less concrete, less realistic, and neuralistic, but far more abstract, even geometrical, cubist. And finally, the last paintings on the canvas became nonsense, or nonsense to me, mere chaotic lines and blotches of paint. I commented on this to Miss P. Ah, you doctors, such Philistines, she exclaimed. Can you not see the artistic development? How he renounced realism in his later years and advanced into abstract, non-representational art? No, that's not it, I said to myself, but forbore to say it to poor Miss P. He has indeed moved from realism to representation, to the abstract, but this was not the artist, but the pathology advancing towards profound visual agnosia, in which all powers of representation are imaginary, all sense of concrete, all sense of reality were being destroyed. This wall of paintings was a tragic pathological exhibit which belonged to neurology, not art. And yet I wondered, was she not partially right for this? Is often a struggle, and sometimes, even more interestingly, a conclusion between the powers of pathology and creation. Perhaps in his cubist period there might have been both artistic and pathological development, concluding to engender an original form. For as he had lost the concrete, so he might gain in the abstract, developing a greater sensitivity to all the structural elements of line, boundary, contour, an almost Picasso-like power to see, and equally depict those abstract organizations, though in the final picture I feared there were only chaos and agnosia. We returned to the great music room with the Bosendorfer in the center. Dr. P humming the last taut. Well, Dr. Sachs, he said to me, you find me an interesting case, I perceive. Can you tell me what you find wrong? Make any recommendations? I can't tell you what I find wrong, I replied, but I'll say that I find right. You're a wonderful musician and music is your life. What I would describe in a case such as yours, is a life which consists entirely of music. Music as being the center, now it makes the whole of your life. This was 4 years ago. I never saw him again, but I often wondered how he apprehended the world given his strange loss of image, visuality, and the perfect preservation of great musicality. I think that music for him has taken the place of image. He had no body image, he had no body music. This would be why he could move and act fluently as he did, but came to a total confused stop if the inner music, he puts in quotes marks, stopped, and equally with the outside, the world. And the world is representation, and Will Schopenhauer speaks of music as pure will. How fascinated he would have been by Dr. P, a man who wholly lost the world as representation, but wholly preserved it as music or will. And this mercifully held to the end, for despite the gradual evidence of his disease, a massive tumour or degenerative process in the visual parts of his brain, Dr. P lived and taught music all to the last days of his life. I think this is 3, 4, 5, 6. There's a 6-page postscript. How should one interpret Dr. P's peculiar inability to interpret, judge a glove as a glove? Manifestly here he could not make cognitive judgment, though his prolific production of cognitive hypothesis. Thus I have learned from his wife, though he could not recognize his students as if they were set still. If they were merely images, he might suddenly recognize them if they moved. That's Carl, he would cry. I know his movements, his body music. A judgment is intuitive, personal, comprehensive, and concrete. We see how things stand in relation to one another and oneself. It was precisely this seeing, this relating, that Dr. P lacked. Though his judging in all other spheres was prompt and normal. Was this due to the lack of visual information or faculty processing of visual information? This would be the explanation given by classical schematic neurology. Or was there something amiss in Dr. P's attitude that he could not relate to what he saw to himself? These explanations or modes of explanation are not mutually exclusive. Being in different modes, they could coexist and both be true. And this is acknowledged implicitly or explicitly in the classical neurology. Implicitly by McCrae when he finds the explanation of defective schemata or the defective visual processing and integration inadequate. Explicitly by Goldstein when he speaks of abstract attitude. But abstract attitude, which allows categorization, also misses the mark with Dr. P, and perhaps with the concept of judgment in general, for Dr. P had abstract attitude, indeed nothing else, and it was precisely this, his absurd abstractness of attitude, absurd because unleavened with anything else, which rendered him incapable of perceiving identity of particulars, rendered him incapable of judgment. Neurology and psychology, curiously, though they talk of everything else, almost never talk of judgment. And yet, in this precisely the downfall of judgment, whether in specific realms as Dr. P, or more generally, as in patients with Korsakoff or frontal lobe syndromes. See below chapters 12 and 13, which constitutes the essence of so many neuropsychological disorders. Judgment and identity may be casualties, but neuropsychology never speaks of them. And yet, whether in a philosophical sense, Kant sense, or empirical and evolutionary sense, judgment is the most important faculty we have in animal or man. We may get on very well without abstract attitude, but will speedily perish if deprived of judgment. Judgment must be the first faculty of higher life or mind. And yet it is ignored or misinterpreted by classical neurology. And if we wonder how such absurdity can arise, we find it in the assumptions or the evolution of neurology itself. For classical neurology, like classical physics, has always been mechanical. From Hewlings-Jackson mechanical analogies to the computer analogies of today. Of course, the brain is a machine and a computer. Everything else in classical neurology is correct, but our mental processes, which constitute our being and life, are not just abstract and mechanical, but personal as well. And such involve not just classifying and categorizing, but continual judging and feeling. Also, if this is missing, we become computer-like, as Dr. P, and by the same token, if we would delete feelings and judging, the personal from cognitive sciences, we reduce them to something as defective as Dr. P, and we reduce our apprehension of concrete and real by a sort of comic and awful analogy. Our current cognitive neurology and psychology resembles nothing so much as poor Dr. Psychology resembles nothing much as resembled. We need the concrete and as real as he did. And we fail to see this as he failed to see it. Our cognitive sciences are themselves suffering from an agnosia, essentially similar to Dr. P and Dr. P's. Dr. P may therefore serve as a warning and a parable of what happens to a science which eschews the judgmental and particular the personal and becomes entirely abstract and computational. It was always a matter of great regret to me that, owing to circumstance beyond my control, I was not able to follow his case further, either in sort of observations and investigations described or in asserting the actual disease pathology. One always fears that the case of unique, especially if it has such extraordinary features as those of Dr. P, was therefore with sense of great interest and delight, not unmixed with relief, that I found quite by chance, looking through the periodical brain for 1956, a detailed description of an almost comically similar case, similar indeed, identical neuropsychological and phenomenologically, though the underlying pathology, an acute head injury, and all personal circumstances were wholly different. The author speaks of their case as unique in the documented history of this disorder, evidently experienced, as I did, the amazement at their own findings. The interested reader is referred to the original paper, McCrae and Troll, 1956, of which I here subjoin a brief paraphrase with quotations from the original. Their patient was a young man of 32 who, following a severe automobile accident, was with unconsciousness for 3 weeks, complained exclusively of an inability to recognize faces, even those of his wife and children. Not a single face was familiar to him, but there were 3 he could identify. These were workmates, one with an eye-blinking tic, one with a large mole in his cheek, and a third because he was so tall and thin that no one else was like him. Each of these, McCrae and Toll bring out, was recognized solely by a prominent feature mentioned in general. There's a note here, I'll read it after I read this sentence. Recognized solely by a single prominent feature mentioned. In general, like Dr. P, he recognized familiars, but only by their voices. Only since the completion of this book have I found there is in fact a rather extensive literature on visual agnosia in general, prosagnosia in particular. Though so scattered in so many languages that it is easily looked over in particular. I had great pleasure recently meeting Dr. Andrew Kurtz's. It was an unrevealed knowledge of the world literature on the subject, and he himself published some extremely detailed studies of patients with such agnosia. See, for example, his paper on visual agnosia, Kurtzer, 1979. Dr. Kurtzer mentioned to me a case known to him of a farmer who developed prosagnosia and in consequence could no longer distinguish the faces of cows and other such patients. An attendant in Natural History Museum who mistook his own reflection for a diorama of an ape, as with Dr. P, and as with McCrae and Tolley's patient, is especially the animate with so absurdly misperceived. That's the end of the note. He had difficulty even recognizing himself in the mirror, as McCrae and Tolley described in detail. In the early convalescence phase, he frequently, especially when shaving, questioned whether the face gazing at him was really his own. And even though he knew it could physically be none other, on several occasions he grimaced or stuck out his tongue, just to make sure. By carefully studying his face in the mirror, he slowly began to recognize it, but not in a flash, as in the past. He relied on the hair and facial outline and 2 small moles on his left cheek. In general, he could not recognize objects at a glance, but would have to seek out a guess from 1 or 2 features. Occasionally, his guesses were absurdly wrong. In particular, the authors note there was a difficulty with the animate. On the other hand, simple schematic objects, scissors, watch, keys, etc., presented no difficulties. McCrae and Tolley note that his topographical memory was strange. The seeming paradox existed that he could find his way from his home to the hospital and around the hospital, but yet could not name streets en route, unlike Dr. P, who had some asphasia, but appeared to visualize the topography. It was also evident that visual memories of people, even from long before the accident, were severely impaired. There was a memory of conduct, or perhaps a mechanism, but not of visual appearance or face. Similarly, it appeared when he was questioned closely that he no longer had visual images in his dreams. Thus, as Dr. P, it was not just visual perception, but visual imagination and memory, the fundamental powers of visual representation, which were essentially damaged in this patient. At least those powers insofar as they pertained to the personal, the familiar, the concrete. A final humorous point where Dr. P might mistook his wife for a hat. McCrae's patient was also unable to recognize his wife and needed to identify her by a visual marker, by a conspicuous article of clothing such as a large hat. So to mix up different types of speaking out loud, I'll probably comment at the end of each of these. I don't have a bookmark. I'll just set that on the table. I mean, I'm up to chapter 2. It's not like I'll lose my place. I'll comment on each section I read. The first time I read Oliver Sacks, The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat, Dr. Oliver Sacks, it ran really personal for me. Now, I don't think for whatever reason I have the same problem as Dr. P and McCrae, the patient of Dr. McCrae. I don't think I have a left-right hemisphere agnosia, but I personally have trouble recognizing faces and people in general, and will often look for markers or, in most cases for myself, a story, something that means a lot to me personally. An example, I had trouble recognizing a friend of mine until I recognize her now quite easily because of an interaction I had with her in a bar where I could not recognize this person at all, my friend. And unlike a lot of people, I forget, I forget to recognize if I haven't seen them for a while, so their features change, maybe their body changes. That's the usual way I don't recognize people. I don't see them for 3 or 4 months. In particular, I'll forget what they look like. But this is a person who lives in the same town as me, and they work in the bar we were in at the time, which I visit quite regularly with friends. So there should have been no reason for me to forget the features of this person, but I did. And she comes to me in the bar and says, "Hey Liam, how's it going? What have you been up to this week?" And I was so confused that this stranger had just come up to me and started talking to me like they knew me. In reality, they did know me. And she says to me, she goes, "What's wrong? You're looking at me as if I'm a total stranger." And I replied, "You are." And she was incredibly offended by this. But that is a memory that sticks in my head because it's so prominent and not necessarily out of the ordinary, because it's happened several times and it happens quite regularly. School friends, I totally forget what they look like unless I have a particular memory or there's something very distinct about their feature. Two people from high school who I always recognize. One of them because this gentleman has alopecia, very distinct feature, and another gentleman who used to style his hair with so much gel it could be used as foundations to a house. It was that rock solid and looked plastic. Looked like Superman's hair in the 70s movie Superman. It looked plastic, absolutely hilarious. But other than those people who have very distinct features, I struggle to recognize. So when I first read this, coming out of high school, I got quite emotional. I felt a connection with the character in the book. And this is a real person. It's not a fictional story, and it was really quite interesting. And I'd never really looked into psychology or neurology at all. It wasn't a field that particularly interested me until I read the first chapter in this book, and I was like, wow, this speaks to me. And that took me on a journey of just reading random scientific articles on psychology and neurology, particularly on Asperger's and autism, as that is a condition I am diagnosed with. Those are my comments on Oliver Sacks' The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat, Chapter 1. I will probably keep reading this book until I decide to read something different. So I'll probably do another 2 or 3 chapters out of this book and then move on to something different. I'm currently reading I forgot his name. The book's there. I will grab it. I'm currently reading this in my own time. Edwin Snowden's Permanent Record. I might read a couple chapters from that as well, just to mix it up. For my own personal sake, obviously, because these videos are for my own personal sake. So I'm not getting into a flow with a particular type of speaking. Great.